Welcome to this event organized by the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU. Today we are delighted to be joined by Genesis Davila and Rodrigo Diamanti, and I will proceed to introduce them in a second, who will be discussing with us the situation in Venezuela, and particularly the recent decision by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to initiate a formal investigation on the basis of the reasonable assumption that crimes against humanity have taken place in Venezuela, particularly since 2017. I am Pablo De Greiff. I am a senior fellow at the center, and I am delighted to be joined by Genesis, who is also a scholar at the center. She is a transitional justice scholar and also a Fulbright and a Hauser scholar at NYU. She is a Venezuelan lawyer. We are also joined, and it also gives me great pleasure, by Rodrigo Diamanti, a Venezuelan economist in this case, but also with a master's in international relations and in public administration from the Kennedy School at Harvard, where he is a research fellow to this day. Both of them have been important actors in Venezuela. Both of them, and I must say, despite their age, but I am, of course, at that age in which everyone who is younger than me seems to be very, very young. But in any case, despite their age, they have accomplished a great deal, and not just academically, but more importantly for this occasion, in practice. Genesis was the founder of an organization called Defiende Venezuela, and Rodrigo, in turn, of an organization called Mundo sin Mordaza, which can be translated roughly as a world without censorship. And before discussing the specifics of the Venezuelan case before the court, I would like each of them to take a couple of minutes to describe what the organizations that they established do and their role in bringing the case to the court. Part of the interest of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU is precisely this type of merger of research and academic activity with practice and activism. And both Genesis and Rodrigo are very good examples of the great benefits that that combination can lead to. So, Genesis, why don't you take a couple of minutes to describe the background and the workings of Defiende Venezuela, and welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pablo, for this lovely introduction. Well, my name is Genesis Davila. I'm from Venezuela. I have been working in the field of human rights for the last 7 years. Back in 2017, I founded Defiende Venezuela, which is an NGO that is focused on the protection and promotion of human rights in Venezuela. The main work that we have been doing in the organization is to report cases of human rights violations before international bodies, mechanisms, and courts. Well, mainly because since we are in this human rights crisis, the Venezuelan judicial system doesn't protect victims anymore. Victims are not allowed to go to our judicial system to report cases of human rights violations, because this, instead of helping them and instead of protecting them, it put them on a greater risk. So we decide to document these human rights cases and report them mainly before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, United Nations, and the ICC. Well, first, because these mechanisms allows victims to file their cases, to request urgent protections, and also because the situation of Venezuela got so bad that from human rights violations, we escalate to crimes against humanity, and then the ICC start to study the Venezuelan situation. So now with Defiende Venezuela, we represent more than 200 victims before these different bodies. And also we have been working on advocacy because, well, we had learned that just filing cases is not enough, particularly when you are facing a political crisis, because in many situations, the judicial cases are not justified with judicial motions and arguments, but actually there are political cases. So we decide to create a more broader strategy that involves activism, involves advocacy before these bodies, advocacy with embassies, and well, that has been the main work that we have been doing. And we do this in partnership with many other civil society organizations. And that is how I met Rodrigo, and that is how we have been working together with the Venezuelan situation for the last 5 years.
So thank you very much, Genesis, and it's a perfect segue to ask the same from Rodrigo to tell us what Un Mundo sin Mordaza does. Before you start, Rodrigo, let me make it clear to the audience that, of course, there will be opportunities for question and answers, which you can post in the Q&A button of in your screens. But Rodrigo, welcome, and please tell us about Un Mundo sin Mordaza.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you everybody for connecting and being interested in what is happening in Venezuela and how is the situation of Venezuela, the court right now. I started working in human rights, I think 20 years ago, when I didn't even know that I was fighting for human rights. When I was 18 years old, I started to join protests in Venezuela to defend democracy, to defend freedom of expression, mainly at the beginning. And in the future, I started as economist, but then I understood that it was needed a lot of effort in order to maintain our democracy. And that's when, in 2008, I found the Un Mundo sin Mordaza, a world without censorship, that was mainly an organization that wanted to help not only the situation of Venezuela, but the reality in other countries. But what really happened is that because the situation in Venezuela has been going down every year, it has become more difficult every year. We have to focus mainly in Venezuela. Of course, we have done important job in other countries like Nicaragua, Cuba, in Argentina, in many other countries, also in Africa. We have made alliance to defend human rights through activism. That's our mainly strength, is doing campaigns to show what is happening in these countries about political prisoners, repression. And with that type of effort, at some point in 2014, I understood that the situation of Venezuela was beyond the violation of human rights, and it was arriving to a level of crimes against humanity. And it maybe not, we didn't have the numbers at the time when I realized this almost like 8 years ago, but I knew that the only way that the present regime, in order to maintain power, was going to be made through repression, through torture, through killing the people who were protesting and asking for democracy and other important human rights. So that's when I started this journey about documenting and presenting information to the ICC. And since then, we have been doing that. And and that's why we're happy that we finally have an open investigation at the court. But I see this just as the beginning, still the beginning of a long journey to bring justice to Venezuela.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Most of the participants in this seminar will, of course, be familiar with the general situation in Venezuela. But nevertheless, I would like you, Rodrigo, if you do not mind, to take just a couple of minutes briefly to describe the general situation in Venezuela. And then I will ask Genesis to describe the path that has led us to where we are today with the recent announcement of the formal investigation by the office of the prosecutor. So, Rodrigo, if you don't mind, take a couple of minutes for an informative description of what you take the human rights situation in Venezuela to be at this point.
So, a lot has happened in Venezuela since I started. I joined the movement of defending human rights and, trying to preserve democracy. And what happened at the end is that we lost completely our democracy. And of course, with the losing of the democracy, of course, we have lost all the capacity, also even to defend human rights internally. Even the right to manifest is being criminalized in Venezuela. And thanks with the intention to control any type of opposition in Venezuela, the government also had controlled so strongly the economy in a way that we were big producers of many things in Venezuela, and we don't produce anything, just oil, because they went after all the economical power in order to control any type of funding for the opposition. But that brought a scarcity into the country, that brought a humanitarian crisis into the country. And also a result of that, it's a huge migration crisis. More than 6 million people have left the country since 2014 at least. And well, imagine what needs to be happening in a country in order to leave everything behind and living outside. And had to live outside and even walking. People have now, there is a lot of people that have walked from Venezuela directly to Peru. People in this process are being trapped by guerrillas, by human trafficking groups. And so the Venezuelan situation is more a humanitarian situation. It's also a crisis in more democracy, and of course a political crisis. But beyond of that, it's a humanitarian and of course a crisis produced by crimes against humanity committed. At least that's the information that we have found so far, is that everything that has been done in Venezuela has been a decision by the hierarchs of the regime in order to control a specific group, to control anyone who wants to dissent. And in order to control anyone who wants to dissent, they have implemented a policy of torture, killing during protest, and imprisonment, and many other inhuman actions against the Venezuelans who have tried in the past 8 years to recover democracy. So I think that's a little bit a piece of what is happening in Venezuela. And of course, anyone has more questions, we're here to clarify them.
Yes, and let me insist the Q&A option is open already, so you can start posting questions from the audience whenever you want. Genesis, could you describe for us briefly the path, the actual path that brought us to where we are at the International Criminal Court? You are muted.
Now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm really sorry. Sometimes it's complicated to.
This is the world of Zoom, so please go ahead.
Well, actually, this has been a long path. It's not that one day the prosecutor of the ICC woke up and decided like, hey, let's open an investigation regarding the Venezuelan situation. Actually, this is not like that, even when we might think it could be like that. But this has been the joint effort of multiple actors among multiple levels. So, well, first, we start with this human rights crisis. And well, the regime was violating human rights in Venezuela. They did it for many years. And in 2017, I think the crisis reached the highest spike that, well, has been facing for the last year. So back in 2017, we had a second period of big protests around the country. And the regime was repressing those protests in a really violent way. They killed hundreds of students and civilians who were manifesting against the regime. They incarcerate more than 1,000 civilians, then they torture them. And many of them had to escape out of the country. So when this happened in 2017, the international community was paying attention to Venezuela. And everybody was worried about what was happening. They say, well, the human rights crisis is getting worse, but actually it was not only a human rights crisis. We escalate from human rights violations to crimes against humanity. And here is where the work of the civil society was important. So I know that back in those days, Rodrigo was in contact with the former prosecutor of the ICC, Luis Moreno Ocampo, and they discussed about the situation like, hey, but what are we gonna do now? Like, there are crimes against humanity in Venezuela. The current office of the prosecutor is not paying attention to this situation. How can we call the attention of the ICC? So they create a strategy and they join efforts with the Organization of American States that they have an agreement of cooperation with the ICC, and they decide to start discussing the crimes against humanity situation in the OAS. This was something new. This never happened before. The OAS never discussed crimes against humanity situations in the past, but still, since that was something that was threatening democracy in our region, they took a long shot and they decided like, okay, we are going to discuss this because this is a regional interest. So the office of the Secretary General of the OAS create a period of sessions, and they invite civil society actors, they invite different officials who step aside of the regime, and they also invite victims to speak about the situation in Venezuela. They create a panel of experts, and they were discussing this for months. So when this discussion started, actually, people was a little bit hesitant of the situation. They were like, well, maybe in Venezuela there are not crimes against humanity, but just human rights violations. And because of this effort, in less than 3 months, everybody was convinced about the crimes against humanity situation in Venezuela, and even the civil society that at the beginning was a little bit was resisting like this new concept. They understood that yes, in Venezuela the situation changed, and now we are facing these terrible crimes. So this brought the attention of the Office of the Prosecutor. And finally, at the beginning of 2018, the Office of the Prosecutor decided to open a preliminary examination regarding the Venezuelan situation. And they opened this preliminary examination to study the context of the protests and the political instability since April 2017. Well, the work of the civil society still helped, because then the same year, the Office of the Secretary General managed to put together 6 countries. And these 6 countries refer the Venezuelan situation to the ICC. So back in 2018, we had this preliminary examination open to study the Venezuelan situation, and 6 states request the Office of the Prosecutor to move forward, not to only study the situation, but to open an investigation. And there, well, it was not only the OAS pushing for this, but also the Human Rights Council pushed for it, and they create a fact-finding mission. And this fact-finding mission was studying the context of Venezuela, and they were studying how they were detaining, torturing, and killing those who try to oppose the regime. So from 2018 to 2021, the former prosecutor, Fatu Bensouda, managed to move forward within the phases of the preliminary examination, but she didn't open the investigation. And still, the international community, the civil society organizations, and the victims were pushing for this investigation. And it was finally in 2021 when the new prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, decided to open the investigation. He did it from Caracas, and he signed a letter of understanding with Maduro's regime to actively collaborate despite, well, difference of opinion on these issues. And now the investigation of Venezuela is open. So this is where we are right now. And I think that the important message here is that all of us play an important role towards justice and towards the protection of human rights. We need to understand that every role is a key role. If you are a victim, you can ask for justice. If you are a civil society actor, you can campaign, you can do a strategic litigation, you can ask to these international bodies to act. And then if you are part of an international organization, well, you have the responsibility to fulfill the mandate of these bodies. So somehow this has been the path that led us to have this situation before the ICC and to open the investigation. And well, that is where we are right now.
Thank you, Genesis. We will come back to the role of civil society and other stakeholders later. We are honored to have in the audience Beth Van Schaak, who has played a prominent role in the State Department in war crimes investigations, in addition to her academic work, and who has been appointed to direct the Office of War Crimes Investigations in the Senate, for which I take the opportunity to congratulate her. She is awaiting confirmation. in any case, she asks already a question which I think is critical about what to make of the memorandum of understanding that was signed between the prosecutor and the government of Venezuela, and also specifically asking what the two of you make of the meeting between the prosecutor and President Maduro. So it would be worth to talk a bit about the contents of the memorandum of understanding and then about the context in which it was signed and the message that the meeting sent. So I invite both of you to say a few things about that. If Genesis wants to start with a very brief, but I want to insist, I'm sorry, very brief description of the contents of the memorandum of understanding, and then Rodrigo to talk about the contextual messages and the role of civil society in making that memorandum of understanding stick. I would appreciate it, and we can continue with more questions. Thanks, Beth, for your important question. So Genesis, on the memorandum of understanding.
Yes, well, the Memorandum of Understanding was signed back in 2021 on November 3rd. And I think that the most important part of this is that this coincides with the completion of the preliminary examination of the situation of Venezuela, the opening of the investigation. So with the opening of the investigation, the prosecutor have a series of investigative powers far beyond those that he had before with the preliminary examination. So among these powers, now he has the possibility to gather and examine evidence. He can also conduct interrogations, and he can take measures to preserve evidence or protect organs that have evidence. And also, well, this is something that will help him to determine who could be the individuals that he can bring before the court. And I think this is important to understand previous to get into the discussion of the details of the memorandum, because if different when you have a memorandum of understanding in the preliminary examination phase than when you have it in the investigation phase, because now the office of the prosecutor has more powers to ensure that the regime or either is fulfilling the agreement, or well, he can bring them before the court. So this was well, the main action that the prosecutor took regarding the Venezuelan situation once that he took power in this new position. And I think that the main focus is over the principle of complementarity. So this principle could be considered as the cornerstone of the Rome Statute, establishing the obligation of states to investigate crimes committed under their jurisdiction, relegating the court to a rather like secondary role, intervening only in the absence of genuine actions by the national justice system. So in this understanding, well, the prosecutor said like, okay, in Venezuela, crimes against humanity have been committed, and now, or you either resolve this issue in Venezuela and you provide justice to the victims, or the ICC will do it. And the answer of the regime was like, okay, we do not agree on that. We do not think that crimes against humanity have been committed in Venezuela, but we have a commitment to, well, start investigations and to show you that we can be in charge of this process in Venezuela without the direct intervention of the court or other international bodies. So, well, the main question will be, can we trust a regime that have been violating human rights and that is committing crimes against humanity, against their people, to now, from one day to other, just to, well, provide them justice and to solve the situation like if nothing happens in the past? And well, this is where we are right now, and this is what we are expecting to see. So from my perspective, I don't think that this memorandum will be enough to save Maduro and the rest of the officers of the regime from international justice. Why? Well, because the violations of human rights and crimes against humanity that have been committed in Venezuela are not just isolated acts, but there are acts that have been protected and conduct that have been protected by the Venezuelan institutions. So the judicial system have been working in a way that they are arm of the executive power, and they protect them and they help them to commit these crimes with impunity. So the memorandum somehow helps the office of the prosecutor to start negotiating with the regime. But at the same time, since now the investigation is open, the regime or either fulfill this, or they know the office of the prosecutor could act in a more direct way. So I think this will help the regime to gain some time. Well, this is the situation where we are right now. So there have been 3 months since the memorandum, and not big changes have been as in Venezuela. And I think this could give them like a couple of years to try to show to the office of the prosecutor that they are doing whatever it takes to provide justice to the victims. But this will not be enough. And I would like to think that the prosecutor office will be smart enough to notice that, well, our justice is genuine and real, or these efforts are not enough to save the regime from the international justice.
Thank you, Genesis. You raised yourself and proceeded to answer the question that is in many people's minds, and that I wanted to ask Rodrigo and Will in any case about the reliability of the government and the significance of a memorandum of understanding signed with the Venezuelan government. Venezuela, as we all know, is a party to all the important human rights conventions, which of course have not kept it from violating very important terms of those conventions. Venezuela has ignored plenty of both decisions by both the Inter-American Commission and the sentences by the court. It hasn't been particularly receptive to the organs of the Inter-American system. So why should we think that in this case, Rodrigo, there are better reasons to expect more reliable responses from the Venezuelan government regarding the terms of the Memorandum of Understanding. I am sure that this is a big concern for everyone. It is certainly for me.
Thank you, Pablo. And I agree with everything that Genesis just told us. Basically, the memorandum, well, the action of the new prosecutor going to Venezuela and open the investigation, it was a big surprise. I think he did it in a good pace. We were concerned by the pace that was made by the previous prosecutor. Actually, we published, and it's another tip for activists, many articles at New York Times and the other important institutions to advocate for the opening of the investigation, because the fact-finding mission already found that crimes against humanity or patterns of crimes against humanity were committed in Venezuela. The OAS issued a report about it, and they had a referral from 6 countries that allowed the prosecutor to start the investigation. And the importance of this is that the initiation of the investigation, and this is correlated with your question, Pablo, is that is what we believe is going to put this fear in the members of the regime, so they will think twice before they apply torture, killing, or persecution to anyone who dissents in Venezuela. Of course, this will not be enough. Nothing has stopped the regime so far, and not even sanctions, not even arrest orders from the US for narco-traffic, not even the start of the investigation, but maybe not at the higher level. But because anyone at this point feel that they can be prosecuted at the court, we hope that this will have a different effect, because I think this process cannot be stopped. At least other type of process, they have more political power to stop it. I don't think that because I don't think they will do any real effort to bring justice to Venezuela. I don't think they will never process the hierarchs who make those orders, because if they do that, they will lose power, because they are only in power because they control an oppressive regime. So they cannot process the regime that sustained them in power. So they will just try to facade and try to make it that looks like they're trying to do any type of process. But that's why that's our role as civil society, is to demonstrate that at the end, and if they do it, we're going to be very happy about it. Let's just make this clear. Like, if they process the people, but they need to even process Maduro, because the information that we have is that all this line of command and all the information and all the proof that we have is start from Maduro. So I don't think he will a dictator. I haven't seen a dictator putting himself into a fair trial. Okay, that's basically the opposite of being a dictator. So I think they will just try to gain time with this MOU. I think the prosecutor may make a good move. Of course, they will have enough time to defend themselves, but at the end, in 1 year or two, I think the ICC will see no progress. So our role as civil society, that's something you also mentioned, is to document pretty well this process, to demonstrate that the complementary is still being can be still applied, because there are non-genuine process of justice for the most high-level hierarchs, who are the ones who create this type of policy. Let's remember, a policy against a specific group can be only made a higher level of command, and of course that includes Maduro. So we have proof of all of this, and I think that's the reason why, of course, they opened the investigation. And so I think they will gain time, but I don't think because they will never process their own people for the crimes that they made and they committed. I think it's just a matter of time that the office of the prosecutor will realize that they need to move forward. And I think when at some point, if arrest orders are being issued, I think that will make a huge impact. in order to stop the implementation of that policy. Let's just be clear. We just want to stop the torture, the killing, and the persecution. And I think this will have this huge deterrent effect, not in the short term, maybe not this year, but maybe we will see a huge effect in the following years. We have learned patience. I've been doing this for 20 years. So we have learned patience, because maybe one of the most difficult fights of anyone who can people can do is to overcome a dictatorship who have robbed their freedom. So we have to be patient. We know that the time of the court is slow, the pace is slow, it's not as fast as we can, but I think it will have a huge impact, at least that's our expectation, on stopping future crimes against humanity. And if it's not, well, I think with this type of action from the ICC, if at the end they issue this arrest order, we also can use this to put more pressure to other countries, to put more pressure into the regime. Because at the end, we haven't found so far a solution for the crisis we're going through, but we're just using the tools that we have in front of us.
I have a great deal of admiration and respect for Venezuelans who have exercised, as you said, not just patience, but also a great deal of persistence. And people like the two of you who have been directly involved and have taken risks, as many of your fellow Venezuelans have, deserve a great deal of respect and a great deal of attention from the international community. So I take the opportunity to make that very, very explicit. It's interesting the two of you seem to converge on the idea that the move, or at least on the part of the government, can be interpreted as a time-buying strategy. Let's buy some time, keep the office of the prosecutor busy, and let's see how things go. But both of you, at the same time, think that that's a strategy that will eventually fail. Of course, because it will not produce the results that the office of the prosecutor would expect in terms of positive complementarity. The question still persists. So then what? Arrest warrants may be issued. There is a long history of not just slow processes in international procedures of this sort. The ICC is dealing with this case in the shadow of the Kenyan case, which, as we must all remember, was eventually dismissed and interrupted in part because of what seemed to be very well established allegations of victim intimidation. I would like to get your views about what happens after the 2 years of time buying that the two of you mentioned, given this history that we cannot simply ignore. The fact is that eventually the ICC will depend on the collaboration of the government. And if it fails to collaborate in fulfilling the terms of the Memorandum of Understanding, of course, I do not assume that you think that it will be more ready to collaborate with the fulfillment of harsher and more demanding terms, like executing detention orders. So then what? What's the strategy, and how do the two of you balance something that I think is extraordinarily difficult, which is how to keep up the determination to participate, to contribute, to make sure that civil society is present in this process as well, and at the same time not awaken expectations that the International Criminal Court, for instance, will be the factor that will radically transform the situation in the country, because that has rarely happened. So how do you establish those balances? And what is your guess about what follows, what you agree that is a period of time buying? So Rodrigo, if you want to start, and then followed by the Genesis.
I mentioned you guys that we have this huge migration crisis, and that's the bad part. The good part of that, or at least the opportunity that we have there, is that, well, first we have a strong diaspora movement to put pressure on these type of institutions to help Venezuela, but also a lot of the victims have left the country. So now they're in a better position to contribute to the court in this whole process. So I think we have enough proof from people who live outside, from people who work for the regime and now live outside. The OAS demonstrate that when they invite two generals and they explain how the Plan Zamora was made. That was the plan to eliminate the opposition. And they brought the proofs of that. We also have the opportunity to talk with the judge who put in prison Leopoldo Lopez. And she mentioned at the hearings how 6 people armed arrived to her office and threatened them that if she didn't sign the arrest order for a opposition leader, she was going to suffer the consequence that the other judge suffered in the past, Maria Lourdes Afiuni, who liberated a political prisoner, and then she was put in prison, raped, had to abort in prison, rape again, and then she's still in Venezuela suffering those consequences. But we have enough people outside of Venezuela, and I think they can be intimidated by the regime. But also, and just going forward to the last part of your question is, is this going to resolve the situation of Venezuela? Of course, it will not. But at least we're bringing one leg of the table that we need to bring in order to recover our country, and that is justice. And I think that's why the ICC is so important. I think it's an institution that everybody trusts right now. I think there is a good expectation about this new prosecutor. We know that it's a long period that will pass until we have justice, and they will never prosecute everyone. But at least it's a step that needs to be done, not only to bring justice, but just to make clear that once they determine, how these crimes against humanity and who commit these crimes against humanity in Venezuela, they will put us in a better situation when we need to negotiate for free and fair elections. We need to put more pressure to the European Union and to other countries to put more pressure on the regime in order to make them to allow to democracy go back to Venezuela through a fair and free election. That's all what we want. That's all what we want, because we only think that we can only recover democracy through democratic means. I think everyone has seen the opposition fighting for 20 years, suffering this huge pain and suffering and misery, but we always have been pacific. We always have been used. The only tools that civilians have is just our voice and our capacity to organize, to manifest and protest or discontent at any cost. The cost of repression, torture, and killing. Myself, I was detained in Venezuela, then I was captured, they raided our office, then I was kidnapped, then I had to escape through the frontier. I'm still doing the fight, and all the people that I know, I think they will never stop until we recover democracy, but through democratic means. And that's why we need all the support of the international community. And so far, I think the ICC will be a key player to demonstrate first to the world which type of regime is in Venezuela, because sometimes people get confused. Sometimes they think they're just a political crisis. No, they're criminals. And after that, we hope that with the strength in civil society in Venezuela and with the support of the international community, we will find a way, an exit door to this huge crisis that have brought so much misery and pain for the Venezuelan people. Just imagine that we were one of the richest countries in the region, and now we have suffered the the destruction of economy, even worse than any country in war. At least even we have the second most important migration crisis in the world, and we are not in a war like Syria. So what will happen in Venezuela is more like a karma. We don't know why we went through this painful process, but we as civil society, we still believe in this institution to help us to bring democracy back one day to our country.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. You indirectly answer a question that was posed in the chat about the protection of Venezuelans that have put their lives at risk. And you answer it both generally and with respect to your own experience. Part of the safety valve, unfortunately, is exile. And part of the answer is determination to continue in the struggle, which is incredibly courageous. Genesis, if you don't mind, also the same question. After the 2 years, then what, and how to keep this balance between opportunity and realism concerning the possibilities of the court?
Yes, well, I think that from the civil society, we have learned that we are the watchers of the process. So we have the responsibility to watch what the court is doing and what the regime is doing. And we need to demand that whatever is happening is according to the respect of the rights of the victims and the finding of justice. So this has been what we have been doing for the last 2 years, and what took us to the opening of the investigation. And I think that this is what we need to keep doing to finally find justice for the victims, and to understand and to discover the truth of what happened in Venezuela back in 2014, back in 2017, to seek for reparations for the victims and to avoid that this could happen and keep happening in Venezuela. So that I think that is our responsibility, you know. So we need to watch the process, we need to report, and we need to demand. But of course that we need to take into account that the excessive length of the proceedings before the court and the limited capacity of the court to initiate like far-reaching trials involving most of the perpetrators is there. We need to take into account that from the court, it's not possible to offer satisfactory reparation to most of the victims. And therefore, we need to push for a judicial reform in Venezuela, and we need to push for a change in the system, because it wouldn't make any sense that while the court is studying and demanding justice for the situation of Venezuela from 2017 on, then the regime will kill, violating human rights and committing crimes against humanity that will never get to an end. So I think that, well, in a long term, well, of course, we need to keep pushing for our strategy regarding the court, but it's more than that. It is not only about the International Criminal Court, it's about what is happening right now in Venezuela. It's about the capabilities of the judicial system, and it's about the victims that they want justice. So maybe one day the court will bring 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 before The Hague, but those 4 are not the responsible of all of the crimes. They will not represent the thousands of victims in Venezuela that have been suffering. So when we are thinking about international justice and when we are thinking about justice in general, well, it is a complex situation, and we need to create a complex a strategy that could include litigation, reforms, reconciliation, but definitely the aim is for a structural change, because if the situation continues the way it has been happening so far, and if our judicial system continues without the capability to prosecute people or to investigate in Venezuela, and if the regime keep violating human rights with 100% of impunity, then the situation will never change. So I think, and I think this is clear in the mind of many of the actors of the civil society. And I'm sure that every time that we talk with victims, we try to show them how the justice works. So, well, at least with the victims that I represent, I try to make this clear for them, because you cannot promise them, for example, that Maduro one day will be in The Hague facing justice, because that is not sure. And I don't know if that is the interest of the court. Maybe they will never prosecute Maduro. Maybe they will prosecute a minister. Maybe they will prosecute the director of the military police, or the director of the intelligence police. But that is not warranted. And then this is just representative. So the real change must be in our system, in our institutions. And then, of course, we need to work with the victims, because they also need to have a change in their perspective and in their hopes for the country. So this is complex. It is not just about one court, one system, one perpetrator, or one victim. It's about the modern history of Venezuela, and it's about the future of the country.
Thank you, Genesis. And we are unfortunately out of time, but I want to thank the two of you profusely. And I want to reiterate my admiration for both the hard-headed realism and at the same time, the determination to look for whatever opportunities are available in order to seek justice. I think that this is a very difficult balance to achieve, and that you exhibit both sides, avoiding romanticism of a willful but totally naive sort, and on the other hand, avoiding cynicism and the idea that nothing is possible. This has been very inspiring in insisting that everyone has a role, that civil society can make an important contribution, but also that there are different routes by which justice has to be sought, and that there is no single institution or a single instance that can provide all solutions. So thank you very, very much for the participation in this event. And more importantly, thank you for the work. I happen to be Colombian, as you know. We are neighbors. We were once part of the very same country, and the suffering of Venezuela in many ways is something that is experienced by Colombians and by the rest of the Latin Americans very, very deeply. So thank you very much for your fantastic work and for your contribution here. So thanks to the audience, and If there are further questions, you can direct them to the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice, and we can make sure that they are directed to both Genesis and Rodrigo. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, everybody.